The call came at the worst possible moment, right in the middle of a high-stakes board meeting where Natalie was presenting quarterly projections to a room full of executives who trusted her judgment. Her phone buzzed once, then again, but she ignored it, assuming it was nothing urgent. Only when the meeting ended did she finally glance down and notice multiple missed calls from her younger sister Rachel, along with a short message. "Call me about Christmas." Something about the wording felt off, too direct, too serious for what should have been a warm holiday conversation. Natalie stepped into her quiet office, closed the door, and returned the call, expecting logistics about dinner, or gifts, maybe even a lighthearted update. But the moment Rachel picked up the tone was completely different. There was no warmth, no excitement, only impatience and a strange tension. Rachel didn't waste time. She explained that their parents' annual Christmas Eve party was happening as usual, but this year was different. Her boyfriend Marcus would be there, a highly respected doctor, with an impressive background, and everything needed to be perfect. Then came the sentence Natalie would never forget. Rachel wanted her to skip Christmas. At first, Natalie thought she had misheard skip Christmas, her own family's gathering, but Rachel doubled down, quickly adding that it wasn't a big deal, and that Natalie shouldn't make it dramatic. The explanation that followed cut deeper than the request itself. Rachel admitted she had painted a certain picture of their family to Marcus. Successful, polished, impressive, and Natalie simply didn't fit into that version. According to Rachel, having Natalie there might raise uncomfortable questions, might ruin the image. The words were delivered casually, almost like a practical decision, rather than a betrayal. Natalie stood there in silence, processing the implication that her presence was something to hide. Then, as if rehearsed, their parents joined the call, gently reinforcing the same message under the guise of support. They spoke about timing, about first impressions, about wanting Rachel to have her moment. No one directly said Natalie was the problem, but every word pointed in that direction. And in that moment, something shifted. Instead of arguing, instead of defending herself, Natalie simply said she understood. Her calm response surprised them. But it wasn't acceptance, it was clarity. Because sometimes the quietest reaction reveals the loudest truth. If this moment shocked you, subscribe now. Because what happens next will completely change everything, and you won't want to miss the truth unfolding. She didn't just ask her sister to skip Christmas, she revealed exactly how she truly saw her. Rachel didn't hesitate after making her shocking request. She immediately moved into explanation mode. But the more she spoke, the worse it sounded. She described Marcus in glowing detail, emphasizing his achievements, his reputation, his background, as if building a pedestal so high that anyone standing next to it would instantly be judged. To Rachel, this wasn't just a boyfriend coming to dinner. This was an opportunity, a moment to elevate her own image by association. She had carefully curated a version of her life to present to him, one where everything looked polished, successful, and perfectly aligned. Their parents fit that narrative well enough, with stable careers and respectable standing. And Rachel herself had positioned her own work in a way that sounded impressive. But Natalie didn't fit into that story Rachel had created, or at least not the version Rachel had chosen to tell. Instead of explaining who Natalie really was, Rachel admitted she had simplified things, said Natalie worked somewhere in a hospital, something vague, something unremarkable, something that wouldn't invite further questions. And the more Rachel justified it, the more it became clear that this wasn't about protecting Natalie. It was about protecting her own image. She spoke about first impressions, about how Marcus came from a family of doctors and academics, how expectations were high, how even small inconsistencies could raise doubts. To her, Natalie wasn't just a sister. She was a potential flaw in the narrative, a detail that didn't match the picture Rachel wanted to present. What made it worse was how casually Rachel framed everything, as if it were common sense, as if anyone would understand and agree. She even suggested that Natalie should see it from her perspective, that this was just a temporary situation, just one holiday, just one night to avoid complications. But beneath that reasoning was something far more painful. Rachel had already decided how much Natalie was worth in that moment, and it wasn't enough to be included. And then came the final layer: fear. Rachel admitted she needed everything to go perfectly, because this relationship mattered more than anything else right now. She believed Marcus was the one, and she was willing to reshape reality, even erase parts of her own family, to secure that future. That was the truth hidden beneath her calm tone. Natalie listened to all of it, without interrupting, but every word revealed a deeper truth. Not about success, not about reputation, but about how easily people can rewrite reality when they're desperate to be seen a certain way. If you think this is already unbelievable, subscribe now, because what happens next will expose even deeper truths you won't expect, and you won't want to miss it. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, but that quiet response said more than any words ever could. When Rachel finished explaining why Natalie shouldn't come to Christmas, the room on the other end of the phone seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a reaction. It would have been easy, almost expected, for Natalie to push back, to question the logic, to remind them of everything they didn't know. After all, the situation was unfair, and the reasoning behind it was built on a version of her that wasn't even true. But instead of challenging it, Natalie did something no one anticipated. She paused, let the silence stretch just long enough to be felt, and then she simply agreed. No raised voice, no visible frustration, no attempt to correct the narrative that had just been placed on her. That calm acceptance confused them more than anger ever could. Rachel hesitated, as if unsure whether she had heard correctly, and their parents quickly filled the space with relief, thanking Natalie for being understanding, for not making things complicated. But what they didn't realize was that Natalie's response was an agreement in the way they assumed it was a decision. A decision not to fight for a place where she clearly wasn't being valued, not to prove herself to people who had already decided who she was without asking, and not to spend energy correcting a perception that had been built over years without her input. In that moment, she recognized something important. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't to argue, it's to step back and observe. Because by saying yes, she wasn't giving up her place in the family. She was allowing the situation to unfold without interference, to see clearly how far their assumptions would go when left unchallenged. There was also a deeper layer to her choice, one she didn't voice but fully understood. If she had pushed back, if she had insisted on attending, the dynamic would have shifted into conflict, and the truth would have been buried under defensiveness and excuses. But by remaining calm, by accepting their request without resistance, she created space for something else: clarity. She gave them exactly what they wanted, and in doing so, she allowed their reasoning to stand on its own, unprotected. And that made it far more revealing. After the call ended, Natalie didn't feel anger the way they might have expected. What she felt instead was a quiet certainty settling in. The conversation hadn't introduced anything new. It had simply confirmed what she had already begun to suspect over time, that her presence in the family wasn't unconditional, that it could be adjusted, minimized, or even removed when it didn't fit a certain image. And once that realization became clear, it changed how she saw everything that followed, because now she wasn't reacting emotionally, she was watching, understanding, and preparing for whatever truth would reveal itself next. If her calm response surprised you, subscribe now, because what happens next will turn this quiet decision into something no one saw coming. As Natalie stood alone after the call, the silence around her wasn't empty. It was filled with memories she had spent years trying to ignore. This wasn't the first time she had felt like an outsider in her own family. It was just the first time it had been said out loud so clearly. Growing up, Rachel had always been the easy one, the cheerful, outgoing daughter who fit naturally into every social situation, who made friends effortlessly, who brought home awards that people understood and celebrated. Natalie, on the other hand, had always existed in a different rhythm. She preferred books to parties, questions to small talk, quiet focus to loud attention. While Rachel thrived in the spotlight, Natalie built her world in the background, piece by piece, without applause. Family gatherings had always reflected that difference. Conversations would drift toward Rachel's achievements, her social life, her relationships, while Natalie's accomplishments were often met with polite nods or quick changes of subject. It wasn't that her parents openly rejected her, they just never quite knew how to connect with her. And over time, that distance turned into quiet misunderstanding. Comments that sounded harmless at first began to leave deeper marks. Suggestions that she was too serious, reminders that life wasn't only about studying or working, comparisons that always placed her just slightly outside the center of attention. None of it felt intentional, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Natalie learned early on that being different meant being overlooked, and being overlooked meant learning to stand alone. And so she adapted. She stopped expecting recognition, stopped explaining herself, stopped trying to fit into a mold that was never made for her. Instead, she poured everything into her own path, building a life that didn't depend on approval. But even as she grew stronger, one question had quietly followed her into adulthood. Would her family ever see her for who she truly was, without needing her to change? That was the question she had been testing all along, without even saying it out loud. And now with a single phone call, she had her answer. Not because they didn't love her, but because their version of her had never truly evolved. In their eyes, she was still the same misunderstood daughter, still the one who didn't quite belong in the picture they wanted to show the world. And that realization didn't break her. It clarified everything. If this part of her past hits close to home, subscribe now, because what happens next will reveal how everything she built is about to turn the entire story upside down. There was a time when Natalie believed that working harder was enough, that if she pushed herself far enough, long enough, she could save everyone who needed saving. As a trauma surgeon, her world had been defined by urgency, flashing monitors, racing heartbeats, split-second decisions, where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. She thrived in that chaos, not because it was easy, but because it felt meaningful. Every shift was a chance to make a difference, to stand between someone and the worst moment of their life. But no amount of skill or dedication could prepare her for the case that would change everything. It happened during one of those exhausting stretches, where time blurred together, where hours passed without rest, where focus became the only thing keeping her steady. The patient seemed stable at first, nothing obvious, nothing alarming, nothing that would suggest what was coming. The monitors showed normal readings. The data looked reassuring, and yet something felt off, something subtle, that couldn't be explained. Then without warning, everything collapsed. The situation escalated too quickly, too violently, leaving no time to recover, no time to correct what had been missed. And just like that, a life was gone. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise she had ever endured. Natalie sat there afterward, replaying every second, every detail, searching for the moment where things could have been different. But the truth was devastating. There had been no clear signal, no obvious sign, only patterns too small, too complex for a human mind to catch in real time. And that realization stayed with her. It followed her out of the hospital, into the quiet hours of the night, into every thought she couldn't escape. Because she knew that what had happened wasn't a single failure, it was a limitation. Not just hers, but the system itself. Medicine relied on human perception, on experience, on judgment. But what if that wasn't enough? What if there was a way to see more, to detect what no one else could, to predict what hadn't happened yet? That question became an obsession. Natalie didn't walk away from medicine, she redefined her place within it. She began to imagine a system that could continuously monitor patients, analyze patterns invisible to the human eye, and alert doctors before a crisis even began. It wasn't just about reacting anymore, it was about preventing. Building that vision wasn't easy. It required stepping into unfamiliar territory, combining medicine with technology, turning an idea into something real and reliable. There were doubts, risks, moments where the path forward seemed uncertain. But every time she hesitated, she remembered that silence, the one that came after losing a patient, and she kept going. Because for Natalie, this was no longer just a career, it was a promise. If this moment changed everything, subscribe now, because what she builds next will not only shock her family, it will change lives in ways no one saw coming. Natalie had always believed that skill, discipline, and relentless effort were enough to control outcomes, especially in a world where every second mattered and every decision carried weight. As a trauma surgeon, she operated in an environment where pressure was constant and mistakes were unforgiving. Yet she had learned to trust her training, her instincts, and the systems around her. But everything changed on a day that started like any other and ended in a way she would never forget. The patient showed no obvious warning signs. At first, the data looked stable. The monitors displayed nothing out of the ordinary. And yet there was a faint, almost unnoticeable feeling that something wasn't right. It was the kind of intuition doctors learn to listen to, but sometimes can't justify. Then without any clear signal, the situation collapsed. Vital signs shifted too fast, the response window closed too quickly. And despite every effort, the outcome could not be reversed. What remained afterward wasn't just grief. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that forced Natalie to confront a truth she had never fully accepted before. She replayed the moment again and again, searching for a missed detail, a sign, anything that could explain what went wrong. But the deeper she looked, the clearer it became there hadn't been a clear mistake. There had been something far more unsettling, limits that even the best training couldn't overcome. Medicine relied on human observation, on experience and judgment, but human perception had boundaries. There were patterns too subtle, signals too complex, changes too small to detect in real time, and that realization shifted everything inside her. Instead of asking how she could work harder, she began asking a different question. What if the system itself could see more than a human ever could? That question didn't leave her. It followed her beyond the hospital walls, into late nights filled with notes, ideas and possibilities that refused to fade. She began to imagine a system that could monitor patients, continuously analyze vast amounts of data instantly, and detect the earliest signs of danger before they became irreversible. Not to replace doctors, but to support them, to extend their ability to protect lives. Turning that vision into reality meant stepping into unknown territory, merging medicine with advanced technology, and facing uncertainty at every step. There were moments of doubt, moments when the challenge felt too big, too complex, too risky. But each time she returned to that one moment, the silence, the unanswered question, the life that could have been saved. And that memory became the driving force behind everything she built next. If you've ever felt how one moment can change everything, drop a 1-inch the comments, because what she creates next will take this story to a level you won't expect. Natalie had never made a deliberate effort to hide her success from her family, yet somehow they knew almost nothing about the life she had built. It wasn't because she was secretive by nature, but because over time she realized that no one was really asking the right questions. Whenever she visited home, conversations rarely moved beyond the surface. Her mother would ask casually if work was going okay. Her father might comment that she seemed busy as always, and Rachel would often steer discussions back to her own life, before Natalie had a chance to say more. At first, Natalie tried to explain. She talked about long hours at the hospital, about research projects, about the challenges of building something new. But her words were often met with polite smiles or vague encouragement, as if what she was describing was too complicated, too distant from what they understood or cared about. Over time, she stopped trying to fill in the gaps. It became easier to give short answers, to simplify her reality into something digestible, something that wouldn't require effort from anyone else to understand. So when they asked what she did, she would say she worked in healthcare technology, at a hospital, which was true but incomplete. When they noticed she lived in a modest apartment, she didn't correct their assumptions about her financial situation. When they joked about her being the serious one who never relaxed, she let it pass. None of it felt worth the energy it would take to change their perception, especially when that perception seemed so firmly set. What Natalie didn't fully acknowledge at first was that this quiet withdrawal had become its own kind of test. Without announcing it, without even planning it consciously, she had created a situation where her family interacted with a version of her they believed to be ordinary, even struggling, and what she observed over time was revealing. Their tone carried subtle differences when they spoke to her compared to Rachel. Their expectations were lower, their curiosity limited, their assumptions often unchallenged. It wasn't cruelty in an obvious sense, but it was a consistent pattern of underestimation, of quiet dismissal, of treating her as less significant within the family dynamic. And the more she saw it, the less she felt inclined to correct it. Because a deeper question had taken root in her mind. If they only valued her when she fit a certain image of success, then what did their love actually depend on? By allowing them to believe she was less accomplished than she truly was, she was observing something more important than recognition. She was observing character. Would they still respect her, include her, care about her in the same way if they believed she was just an average person with an ordinary life? Or would she gradually become invisible in the shadow of a more socially acceptable narrative? The answer came not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small interactions that added up over time, each one reinforcing the same quiet truth. And by the time Rachel asked her to skip Christmas, Natalie already understood what that truth was. The request didn't create the problem. It simply revealed it in its most undeniable form. On Christmas Eve, while the city outside glowed with warm lights and quiet celebration, Natalie found herself far removed from the version of family she had grown up with, yet strangely closer to something that felt more genuine. Instead of sitting in her parents' living room, listening to carefully curated conversations and watching Rachel present her perfect life, she chose to spend the evening with the people who had stood beside her, not because of obligation, but because of shared purpose. The invitation had come from her chief technology officer, who insisted she shouldn't spend the holiday alone, and though she hesitated at first, she accepted. The house was filled with laughter that didn't feel forced, with conversations that moved naturally from one idea to another, without judgment or comparison. Children ran through the hallway, showing off their school projects. Adults gathered around the table, discussing not only work, but dreams, failures, and the strange, unpredictable journey of building something meaningful. Natalie sat quietly, at first observing, almost surprised by how different it felt. No one asked her to simplify who she was. No one reduced her to something easier to understand, and no one compared her to anyone else. Instead, they were curious. They asked questions not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest, wanting to understand not just what she did, but why she did it. And for the first time in a long time, she answered without holding anything back. She spoke about the challenges of creating technology that could predict life-threatening complications, about the responsibility that came with knowing people's lives depended on what she had built, about the constant balance between innovation and caution. The more she shared, the more the room leaned in, not with skepticism, but with respect. Meanwhile, miles away, her family was celebrating without her, unaware of what they had chosen to exclude. Rachel was likely introducing Marcus, smiling confidently, presenting a version of reality that felt safe and controlled. Photos were probably being taken, moments being captured, narratives being reinforced. And yet, in that carefully arranged environment, something essential was missing, something that couldn't be replaced by appearances alone. Natalie didn't check her phone that night, didn't look at the messages or the social media updates that might have shown her what she was missing. Because for the first time, she didn't feel like she was missing anything at all. Instead, she felt a quiet clarity settling in. The idea of family, she realized, wasn't defined solely by shared history or obligation. It was defined by presence, by respect, by the willingness to see someone fully without trying to reshape them. And in that room, surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was, she experienced a different kind of belonging, one that didn't require her to shrink or explain herself. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real. And that realization would stay with her long after the night ended, becoming another piece of the truth she could no longer ignore. He walked into the room expecting to evaluate a technology, but instead he came face to face with a truth that would change everything. On the day of the consultation, everything was prepared with precision. The kind of quiet, controlled environment Natalie had built her entire professional life around. The conference room overlooked the city skyline, sunlight reflecting off glass buildings, as if nothing unusual was about to happen. Her team had spent days organizing every detail: data presentations, clinical case studies, live demonstrations of the AI system, each part carefully structured to show not just innovation, but reliability. For Natalie, this meeting wasn't personal. It was another opportunity to prove that what she had built could save lives on a larger scale. When the team from the hospital arrived, the atmosphere shifted slightly, the kind of subtle tension that comes with high expectations. Leading them was Marcus, confident, composed, exactly as Rachel had described someone used to being respected the moment he walked into a room. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Formal greetings were exchanged, introductions were made, and the meeting began like any other. Natalie introduced herself simply, without emphasis, without revealing anything beyond what was necessary. But as she spoke, as she walked them through the origin of the system, the clinical results, the impact it had already made, something began to change. Marcus listened carefully, but there was a growing uncertainty in his expression, a sense that something didn't align with what he thought he knew. It wasn't just the scale of the work, it was the person presenting it. Then came the moment that broke the illusion completely. A simple question about her background, about her family, about whether she had connections in the city. Natalie answered calmly, mentioning her younger sister. The name was enough. Marcus froze. The room, which had been filled with professional focus, fell into a heavy silence. The realization hit him all at once. This wasn't just any executive or researcher. This was Rachel's sister. The same person Rachel had described in completely different terms, the same person she had chosen to exclude. His reaction couldn't be hidden. Confusion turned into shock. Shock into something deeper, an uncomfortable awareness that the story he had been told didn't match reality. For a moment, the professional setting seemed to blur, replaced by the weight of personal truth, colliding with facts he could see right in front of him. Natalie, however, remained composed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger, didn't allow the situation to derail the purpose of the meeting. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She continued. She redirected the focus, back to the technology, back to the patients. It could help back to the reason everyone was there in the first place. And that choice spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Because in that moment, it became clear who she was, not through explanation, but through action. Marcus sat there caught between two realities, the one he had been told and the one he was witnessing. And the difference between them was impossible to ignore. If this twist surprised, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment, because what happens next will completely change how this story ends. After the moment of realization settled over the room, Marcus found himself caught in a situation he had never anticipated, one where professional respect and personal confusion collided in an almost suffocating way. The silence that followed Natalie's calm confirmation wasn't just awkward. It carried weight, the kind that forces a person to reassess everything they thought they understood. For Marcus, it wasn't only about who Natalie was, it was about what that meant for everything Rachel had told him. The image he had been given was simple, almost dismissive. A sister who lived quietly, worked an unremarkable job, someone who wasn't really part of the family's success story. But the woman standing in front of him now was the complete opposite of that narrative. She wasn't just accomplished. She was leading, innovating, shaping a field that directly impacted lives on a massive scale. And the more he processed it, the more uncomfortable the gap became. It wasn't a small exaggeration or a harmless omission. This was a complete distortion of reality. Marcus felt the weight of that realization pressing down on him as he tried to remain focused on the purpose of the meeting. He asked questions, engaged with the data, evaluated the system with the same clinical precision he was known for, but internally, something had shifted. Every answer Natalie gave only reinforced what he was beginning to understand, that she wasn't just credible, she was extraordinary. And yet Rachel had chosen to hide that, to redefine it into something smaller, something less threatening to her own narrative. That contradiction was impossible to ignore. At one point, Marcus's attention drifted briefly, his eyes lingering on the materials in the room, the credentials, the recognition that surrounded Natalie's work. These weren't things that could be easily dismissed or misunderstood. They were clear, undeniable proof of a reality he had never been shown. And in that moment, a deeper question began to form, not about Natalie, but about Rachel. Why would someone diminish their own family like that? What did it say about trust, about honesty, about the foundation of the relationship he thought he was building? Despite everything, Natalie never allowed the tension to derail the discussion. Her tone remained steady, her focus unwavering, guiding the conversation back to where it belonged. It wasn't avoidance, it was control, a deliberate choice to separate personal truth from professional responsibility, and that more than anything left an impression on Marcus. Because while he was struggling to reconcile two conflicting realities, she had already moved forward, grounded in who she was, without needing validation or explanation. By the time the meeting neared its end, the atmosphere had shifted again. But this time, it was different. The shock hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else: respect, clarity, and an unavoidable sense that something important had just been revealed, not only about Natalie's success, but about the fragile nature of perception itself. What people choose to show, what they choose to hide, and how easily those choices can shape entire beliefs without ever being questioned. And for Marcus, that realization would not end. When he walked out of the room, it was only the beginning. The aftermath of the meeting didn't take long to unfold, and when it did, it came with a force Rachel had never prepared for. What she had carefully constructed over time, a polished image, a controlled narrative, a version of her life that felt safe and impressive, began to crack under the weight of reality. Marcus didn't react with anger at first, and that made it even more unsettling. Instead, there was distance in his voice, a quiet shift that Rachel could immediately feel, but couldn't control. He asked questions not loudly, not aggressively, but with a calm insistence that forced her to confront what she had said and what she had left out. At first, Rachel tried to explain it away, framing it as a misunderstanding, as a way of simplifying things, as something that wasn't meant to hurt anyone. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about miscommunication, it was about intention. Marcus wasn't confused anymore, he was disappointed, and that difference changed everything. For him, the issue wasn't Natalie's success or the gap between perception and reality. It was the fact that Rachel had chosen to present her own sister in a diminished way, not out of necessity, but out of convenience. That choice raised questions he couldn't ignore. If she could reshape something as fundamental as family to fit a narrative, what else could be adjusted, hidden, or redefined? When it suited her, trust once shaken doesn't break loudly, it erodes quietly, and Rachel could feel that happening in real time. She tried to hold on to the version of the relationship she believed in, reminding him of their plans, of the future they had talked about, of everything that had felt certain just days before. But Marcus didn't respond to those reassurances the way he once might have. Instead, he focused on what had been revealed, on the pattern behind the decision, on the implications that extended beyond a single situation. And eventually the distance became final. The relationship ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, undeniable conclusion, one built on the realization that honesty and respect couldn't be negotiated. At the same time, the truth reached Natalie's parents, and their reaction was immediate, but complicated. Shock came first, followed by confusion, and then a wave of regret that was difficult to process all at once. They had spent years operating under assumptions that now felt fragile and incomplete. The daughter they thought they understood was suddenly someone entirely different, not because she had changed, but because they had never taken the time to truly see her. Their initial instinct was to fix things quickly, to apologize, to reach out, to restore what they now realized they had damaged. But what they didn't fully grasp yet was that understanding comes slower than regret. Natalie didn't respond with anger or accusations. Instead, she maintained the same calm distance she had shown all along. Not out of coldness, but out of clarity. Because for her, this wasn't just about one decision or one moment. It was about a pattern that had taken years to reveal itself. And now that it was visible, it couldn't simply be undone overnight. The situation had shifted not only for Rachel, not only for her parents, but for everyone involved. The version of reality they had relied on was gone, replaced by something more honest, more uncomfortable, and ultimately more real. If you want to see what happens next, and how this story truly unfolds, don't forget to subscribe, because the next part will take everything even further. When everything settled, the noise faded, the calls slowed down, and the emotional storm that had shaken everyone began to quiet. Natalie found herself standing in a space that felt unfamiliar, yet strangely peaceful. Nothing in her external world had truly changed. Her company was still growing. Her work continued to save lives, and her days remained filled with purpose, but internally something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The illusion she had carried for so long, the hope that her family would one day see her clearly, without needing proof of success, had been replaced by a deeper understanding of reality. And while that truth carried a certain weight, it also brought clarity. For the first time, Natalie was no longer questioning her place, no longer wondering if she needed to explain herself more, prove herself differently, or shrink parts of who she was to be accepted. She understood now that acceptance built on conditions is never truly acceptance. And respect that depends on status is never truly respect. Her parents' attempts to reconnect came more gently this time, not with assumptions or expectations, but with hesitation, as if they were learning how to approach her again from the beginning. They spoke more carefully, listened more than they talked, and for the first time asked questions they should have asked years ago, not about what she achieved, but about how she felt, what she valued, and who she had become through her journey. It didn't erase the past, and it didn't immediately rebuild what had been broken, but it created something new, a possibility. Natalie didn't rush into forgiveness because she knew that real change takes time, and trust is something that must be rebuilt through consistency, not words. Rachel, on the other hand, remained more distant, her apology quieter, less certain, as if she was still trying to understand the full impact of her actions. And perhaps that was part of the lesson as well, that growth doesn't happen at the same pace for everyone. But what mattered most was not how quickly others changed, but how clearly Natalie saw herself now. She no longer needed their validation to define her worth, because she had already built something far greater than recognition. She had built purpose. And from that purpose came a series of lessons that extended far beyond her own story. That true value is not determined by how others perceive you, but by the integrity of what you do when no one is watching. That people will often treat you based on the version of you they understand, not the truth of who you are. And it is not your responsibility to shrink yourself to fit their expectations. That success can reveal people's perceptions, but it cannot create genuine respect where it never existed. And perhaps most importantly, that belonging is not about being included in every space, but about finding the spaces where you are seen, heard, and valued without conditions. As Natalie looked out over the city one evening, watching the lights stretch endlessly into the distance, she realized that the journey she had been on was never just about proving something to others. It was about discovering something within herself, and that discovery, quiet and steady, was more powerful than any recognition she could have received. If this story made you reflect on your own life, don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more stories like this waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson you might need at just the right moment.